thanks again, Frank, for doing this. I think it's really cool to bring back an event that sort of happened and then sort of ghosted the campus, right? I mean,
Oh, well, I'm so glad to be with you, and I love that we're bringing the writing and the disciplines at GW and Planet Forward together. It's kind of an inspired idea.
well, I mean, it seems natural with the. I remember the first thing you told me about Planet Forward is narrative, right? That this is about narratives and
It's
how
all
do you
about
get
storytelling.
people motivated and how do you get people thinking about things, and we do that through narratives, not just data or statistics or facts.
Heaven
But
forbid. No, but and by the way, just as we've got people joining us now, and so you and I'll chat for a few minutes, and then we'll get started here. We have a pretty good crowd, I think, joining us today. We had a lot of people register for this. I love
yeah,
that.
yeah, I'm excited by it.
Well,
That's
bringing
cool.
bringing bringing science and storytelling, environment and biodiversity and music together.
Right. I mean, I think that's what's going to be cool about the talk is that Jonathan's work goes all the way across from the Moth to the Milky Way, as he calls it. But I think the music from music to the Milky Way, maybe, and cutting across science and arts, and so I hope a lot of people are coming. I hope a lot of people are bringing their own perspectives from those different areas, and maybe have some questions for him about how he sort of crosses in between those spaces.
Well, the wheels are spinning in my head, and I'm really anxious to hear what he's got to say, both from his presentation and his when he joins us for Q&A. We'll I'll tell the audience that's with us now, and then we can formally get started. We're going to see some of Jonathan from what he's produced, and then we're going to talk to him, and then you're going to talk to him. And so if you've got questions, if anybody who's joining us now, the audience has questions, put them in the Q&A function anytime, and we'll get to them when we get to them. But maybe, Phil, we should get started.
Yeah. All right. So our guest today is, first of all, I'm Philip Troutman, the Director of Writing in the Disciplines at George Washington University. And our very special guest, who's not anywhere near Washington, D.C. right now, is Jonathan Meiburg. He was the 2020 Writing in the Disciplines Distinguished Lecturer. And we're very happy to bring him back for this virtual/live event. He is that rare species, the singer-songwriter ornithologist you may not have known existed. He leads the band Shearwater, who have a brand new album coming out called The Great Awakening, and whose style Pitchfork calls Baroque pop. But Jonathan once described it more specifically as sort of lyrical, mystical art rock for fans of natural history museums. In his spare time, he assembles bird skeletons at the Smithsonian, I am told, and is the author of A Most Remarkable Creature, The Hidden Life and Epic Journey of the World's Smartest Bird of Prey, which took him on his own journeys across South America, from Tierra del Fuego to Guyana and everywhere in between. Frank Sesno, as many of you know, is the journalist's journalist. In some 18 years at CNN, he served as bureau chief, anchor, White House correspondent, and more. For 11 years, he served as GW's director of the School in Media and Public Affairs, where he still serves as its director of strategic initiatives. And he created Planet Forward to bring students and experts together to examine sustainable innovations that move the planet forward, with an emphasis on, or at least one of my favorite aspects of this project is thinking about narrative and how it motivates people to action. Take it away, Frank. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Phil, and welcome to you, and welcome to all of our attendees and those who will join us. I like to refer to this as Studio 1A. It's a creation of COVID and my house, and I'm delighted to be coming to you from this place. As Phil said, I started Planet Forward some years ago at George Washington University. You can see it at planetforward.org, to bring together people who have stories to tell and can tell stories and can craft the narrative around those issues that relate to our sustainability and the future of our planet and climate and food and energy and water and biodiversity in the built environment. And so what Jonathan does and has done is perfect and so inspiring, because he brings science together with passion. He brings narrative together with with characters. And he takes us to a world of biodiversity that is fascinating in its own way, but also a window on the rest of what we live and what we experience and what's in store for us if we don't get it right, because all of these creatures are so perilous. And by bringing the music, his music and his science and these incredible interests, he is, I think, one of the most multidimensional, talented, interesting people I've ever come across. And if you haven't read his book, read his book. And there's a new one, and he and I will be talking about that too. Maybe a while, but stay tuned. Here's what we're going to do, everybody. We're going to, for about 30 minutes, take a look at this remarkable presentation that he put together. And then we're going to get together with him live and speak with him. And that's where we'll bring in your questions. So if you've got questions now from the book or anything else, feel free to go in the Q&A function, Q&A, and put your questions in. We'll put those to him. Or if you're inspired as we go, put your questions in as we go. And I know Jonathan's looking forward to this very much. He's with us. He's very excited, as are we. So without further ado, let us take a look at what Jonathan had to say and share. And then we'll build out from that in person and live. And thanks again. Remember, questions in the Q&A. Victoria, I'll turn it over to you to hit play on the video.
I'd like to show you some of the films of a French filmmaker named Jean-Paul Levay. He was born in 1902, an average student who left Polytechnic school because he was terrified by mathematics, left medical school because he was appalled by an instructor's cruelty to a hydroencephalic patient, and eventually trained as a biologist at the Sorbonne, where he met and hung out with a family of militant anarchists. They had those then, too. And one of them, Geneviève Hamon, became his partner in work and in life. Though Levay trained as a scientist, he rubbed shoulders with the surrealists. He wrangled ants for Salvador Dali's film Un Chien Andalou, and later became an actor and a filmmaker. What we might call documentary film now hardly existed then, much less natural history films, but Jean and Geneviève kept returning to the natural world for their subject because they were irresistibly attracted to its beauty and sometimes its subversiveness. In their view, seahorses, for example, had a lesson to offer us about the malleability of gender. Science is fiction, he declared, by which I think he meant that our imaginations often fall short of the complexity and beauty of the actual physical world. And he set out to prove it by taking the camera places it hadn't yet been, especially underwater, where he loved filming the weird and wonderful creatures that lived in tidal pools on the coast of Brittany. Reality, he said, is a creator of a surreal life. And though his films might seem primitive in the age of CGI and Planet Earth, their sense of humor and wonder is still fresh. And in their time, they delighted many and appalled some, including scientists who sniffed that they weren't real science and artists who said that they weren't real art. I should begin this part of the talk by saying that I only really started seeing and hearing the natural world and thinking more about science after I left college. As an English major, I was a little suspicious of the sciences, not because I didn't believe in science, but that I told myself that science's approach to the world seemed reductive, dedicated only to taking everything apart. But now, I think I was just too afraid to admit to all that I didn't know. Seeing what's right in front of you, understanding where you really are, is the hardest work of both art and science, and it's as difficult now as it's ever been. Maybe more. On the one hand, the past few centuries have revealed bewildering things to us about our place in the world of living things and our place in time and space. But these discoveries, though they've quickly entered into the realm of convention, are so big and so strange that we tend to nod vaguely in their direction and keep on doing whatever it was we were doing, in the same way that we might admire Chinua Achebe or Shakespeare or Virginia Woolf, but we often neglect to actually read them. This strange mandala is the universal genetic code, and if you're anything like me, its real meaning is not immediately apparent, or wasn't to me for a long time, even after I first learned it and forgot it in high school. And it wasn't until I saw a slide like this one in a sleepy intro genetics class in grad school that I realized what it was actually telling me. Expressed as simply as possible, which is also the level at which I understand it, it means that the information stored in DNA molecules use a series of 3-letter chemical code words to instruct other molecules to build amino acids, out of which your body and all living bodies, plant, animals, or otherwise, are made. So far, so good. But the universality of this code is in many ways its most striking feature, because as far as we can tell, it appears to be inherently arbitrary. If life had arisen from many different sources, you'd expect to see a multiplicity of different codes used to build amino acids in different forms of life. But instead, the same chemical codes translate into the same amino acids in just about every living thing. And that all of this DNA, in all of these individual beings and lives, speaks in the same chemical language, leaves us a trail of breadcrumbs that appears to lead back to a common source, a common single ancestor for everything that lives today, one you could probably hold in your hand, suspended in a drop of water. This astonishing fact lies in such plain sight that we rarely talk about it. You might have seen the slogan that you share 99% of your DNA with a chimpanzee and you share about 60% with a banana. And the accuracy of those particular numbers can be debated, but the undisputable fact at its heart is that you share your DNA itself, the basic plans for the chemical process that produced you, with everything that lives on Earth. And the realization, the feeling as much as the thought, that you are related to a snail, a radish, a crocodile, a lightning bug, a tapeworm, a dolphin, a giant squid, a longleaf pine, a jellyfish, a tree fern, a slime mold, in exactly the same way that you are related to your parents, your sister, or your siblings. Wait a minute, your sister is a sibling. Your cousins is what I have here. That it's a difference of degree, but not of kind. It's a hell of a thing to absorb. So much so that it's not too hard to understand why there are still people who refuse to accept it. And in a way, I suspect these folks have done more of a certain kind of contemplation about it than most of us outside the biology department actually do. But it hit me hard that one day, and I remember walking outside after that class through the sterile halls of the molecular biology building and seeing a huge spreading live oak tree on the corner, and in its shade a group of blue-black birds called great-tailed grackles, craning their long beaks toward the sky. And I remember thinking and feeling, we are not strangers to one another. And for a moment, I felt less alone than I ever had in my life. We're all an expression of what? I guess you could say being, and of a chemically expressed urge for being, the origins of which are still obscure. I worked one summer with an ornithologist on a bird survey in the deserts of West Texas, which has some of the darker skies in the United States. And we were standing one night looking up through the silence into the Milky Way. And after a while he said, "You know, evolution's a great theory, but it doesn't even pretend to explain why all this shit is here." Then we had a beer. But I don't mean to be glib about this. The author Bruce Chatwin wrote that walking is a virtue and tourism is a deadly sin, by which I think he meant that tourism has very little to do with learning. Because as a tourist, you already know what you're going to see. You just want a preconceived image validated. But you've probably also noticed that if you're in a crowd of people looking at the same thing at the same time, it can be more difficult to actually perceive it. It's as if objects, people, even ideas can wilt or fade or become strangely distorted under the gaze of too many hungry eyes. And I say this because to me this idea, this chemically demonstrable idea of the fundamental unity of all life, only has power. It's only really working on you when you feel that no one is helping you to lift it, when it's a real effort to hold it in your mind, rather than a fact that rests comfortably and vaguely in the background. When it's so big, it shocks you or eludes you, because that's when it demands more than an abstract murmur of assent. It calls on you. It demands a response, which is the opposite of tourism. There's a parallel secret hidden in the geological sciences, which I think accounts for the sort of zen-y energy you can sense emanating from that place in its majors sometimes. Do we have any geology majors in here? No? Okay, we're safe. When I was a student, it seemed kind of cultish to me. I was like, what made everyone so groovy over there? What did they know? The answer, I think, lies in the relationship that geologists have to time. Because rocks, even the most commonplace rocks, are so old, geologists have to tune their minds to a different time scale from the ones we're used to in our daily lives. The writer John McPhee called this a sense of deep time. And as with the origins of life, the age of our world is one of those dull facts you sort of know but don't really think about. Even after I left college, I would have said it's 2 billion years old or something, maybe 3. And we throw these numbers around like the military budget, a billion here, a billion there. And the ease with which we do this reflects the fact that we don't really feel what we're talking about. This is the Canyon Diablo meteorite, which circled in the asteroid belt for a very long time before landing in Meteor Crater in Arizona about 40,000 years ago. And it was in part by dating the age of this rock that scientists managed to figure out in 1956 how old our solar system, and by extension our universe, and by extension again, every single atom in your body really is. 4.6 billion years. The writer Peter Matheson once said that there's a perfectly good answer to God's famous question in the biblical book of Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the universe?" In context, this question seems intended to shut Job up, but as Matheson pointed out, a perfectly correct response to this question is, I was there. But trying to really imagine 4.6 billion years, let alone 1 million or even 1,000, is nearly impossible. In the English department, the oldest book we read was Homer, who described a world of spear-wielding warriors that seemed pretty remote, and those stories date from about 3,000 years ago. Wind the clock back even a little from there and things start getting really weird. 15,000 years ago, there were still woolly mammoths, giant sloths, camels, and saber-toothed cats living right here. And though humans had been on the scene for a while already, they hadn't yet invented agriculture or walked across the Bering Strait into the Americas. So when scenes like this, as recent as this, seem fantastic, going back into the far reaches of our planet's history means peering into a vertigo-inducing depth. One example that's sometimes used is compressing the history of the Earth into a week, with the Earth forming at midnight on Sunday. And viewed this way, the dinosaurs appear at about 4 p.m. on Saturday, and the Industrial Revolution is about a half a second before midnight. Looked at another way, if you compress the Earth's history into a year, the Roman Empire lasts 5 minutes. In a way, this abundance of deep time is luxurious. Geologists and paleontologists know that life on Earth has been nearly destroyed and reasserted itself, reimagined itself multiple times, that there were landscapes and climates here in the past that have no equivalents today. There were about 1 billion years of Earth's history without life at all, when it was covered by sterile oceans. Then another 3 billion years of unicellular life that we would hardly recognize. It's not until 600 million years ago that we start to see evidence of multicellular life. So the humbling fact is we are very late on the scene, living in a tiny sliver of our planet's history. Then there's plate tectonics, a revolutionary discovery that wasn't really confirmed until the 1960s, and as with all revolution in thought, smart people argued forcefully against it. Most of us in here grew up with this as a sturdy, accepted fact, but it really is a very strange thing. It tells us improbably enough that the Earth's crust, the solid ground we feel so sure of, is actually a flimsy layer floating on a gooey, viscous mantle, and that it's always breaking apart, smashing into other pieces of itself, folding and crumbling, anything but durable. It tells us that the mild, rounded Appalachians just west of here were once taller than the Himalayas, that the Amazon once flowed west before the rising Andes forced it to change direction, that there were so-called full greenhouse versions of Earth with no ice caps at all, and a snowball Earth whose surface was frozen from pole to pole, and this mind-bending stuff goes on and on. It has a wonderful way of making the political distinctions we're so invested in seem flimsy. I don't mean to make light of the boundary disputes over islands in the sea west of Japan, for instance, but geologists know that Japan will eventually be part of California, unless it gets intercepted by a northward bound Australia on its way across the Pacific, and that all the continents will reunite into a new supercontinent in about 200 million years. Astronomers can sometimes be a little more dreamy and solemn than geologists. I don't know if you know any astronomers. They're hard to find sometimes. But I sometimes wonder if that's because they live in the glare of a sobering fact, that life on Earth is well past middle age. Because of the inevitable decay of our sun, we might have no more than 500 million years to go before the oceans are vaporized and the Earth goes into a sort of second childhood in which it goes dark, glows red, and eventually melts into the sun's ballooning face, which will one day be right here where we're sitting. It's a while before this happens, about as long as there's been multicellular life. But if we return to our week metaphor, that means it's one day away. Regardless of anything human beings do or don't do, everyone here is sitting in life on Earth's last act. Doesn't this spark something in you? Doesn't this stick in your throat? Fright, wonder, joy, despair, all of these seem like pretty valid reactions to seeing yourself in these contexts. They're unbearable, volatile emotional states, feelings that want to get out, radiate light and heat. And if there's a universal wellspring for art, I think this is it. It's like a ringing phone. Aren't you going to pick it up? Isn't it harder not to? Paradoxically, I think this unstable, action-forcing feeling of glimpsing yourself in a much broader context might have been easier for our ancestors to access than it is for us now, despite all that we've learned about our Earth and the cosmos. Partly because I think we're becoming victims of our own conceptual success. Plato might not have been right about the world when he said it consisted of a realm of forms and a realm of real things, but he seems to have been right about the human brain. There really are two of everything, the thing that actually exists, and then that thing as we understand it and interact with it. And the digital world, where we spend more and more of our daily lives, is the most powerful manifestation of this impulse that we've ever produced. Plato compared humans to prisoners chained inside a cave with their backs to a source of light, forced to decipher what's really going on behind them by its shadows. And I always think of this when I enter a room where everyone is hunched over a laptop. But I don't think it's impossible to stand up and turn around every once in a while and stare into the light itself, even if it's too bright to look at for too long. In the old film version of The Wizard of Oz, Kansas, the real world, is shown in black and white, and Oz, a creation of Dorothy's imagination, is in Technicolor. But I kind of think it's the other way around, and I think Jean-Paul Levay would agree. Sometimes I wonder if the capacity to make art evolved in us as a kind of urge for conceptual reproduction to echo our urge for physical reproduction. It's like a different kind of fecundity, and there's a psychic itch it scratches, a desire to touch the world beyond our minds, to produce conceptual offspring that can pierce this bubble's cloudy membrane. I think you can, if you like, think of art, any kind of art, as nature speaking through us, and not just metaphorically, since the minds we use to create our conceptual worlds, even the internet, evolved by natural processes far older than us. The oldest human rock art on Earth we know of is about 40,000 years old, which means that art, I'm happy to say, predates money. It also predates agriculture. It predates anything we know for sure about language. Visual, or light-based art, is of course usually the first thing we think of when we talk about art, but visual art depends on an audience with eyes and brains like the eyes and brains of the person who made it. And luckily for visual artists, this is a way that most humans are very much alike. There's some variation, of course, but in general we agree about yellow, red, blue, green, light, dark. Our brains' inherent inherently arbitrary interpretations of electromagnetic vibrations, which in reality shade into each other smoothly across a gradient, but to our eyes, they appear beautifully and falsely as the discrete color bands of the rainbow, a perceptual illusion that we share. The history of sound-based art, which I guess we can call music, is harder to think about, partly because of the lack of evidence. These days we're so awash in recorded sound that it's easy to forget that there was no such thing on Earth until the 1850s, the first widespread use of electric phonographs in the 1920s and magnetic tape in the 1950s, and everyone in this room has lived through most of the history of digital media. But before 1850, our record of the sound of the natural and human world is quite literally silent. And yes, there's musical notation, but that preserves only partially a comparatively small slice of a few very particular traditions. Most music made by humans escaped into the air, never to be heard again. And some of its power came from its fleeting nature. It was something that could only happen in the present moment, and when it was over, it was gone forever. I'm not sure, and I realize how this sounds coming from someone in my line of work, that the invention of recorded music, by uncoupling music from the present moment, has entirely improved it. Music didn't used to exist without your active participation in it, and now it can. It's hard not to see that sometimes as a loss. Not every living thing makes visual art, though I think there's a strong case to be made for a few I can think of, but a great deal of them make sounds and use them to communicate, to attract mates, and to illustrate their emotional lives. So the desire to make sounds ourselves is a trait we've inherited from our ancestors, stretching back to a time when ancestors means scaly things with legs. And in the past few years, researchers from Duke University have statistically analyzed patterns of frequency and amplitude in human speech sounds based on recordings of more than 500 people from around the world. And what they found is that the points at which sound energy is concentrated in human speech, the blink and you'll miss it tones in which we speak every day, just like the colors we perceive in visible light, don't range at random across a smooth gradient, but cluster around 12 distinct tones, separated by what's sometimes called a half step, the same scale represented by the black and white keys on a piano keyboard. A sonic rainbow, you might say. Moreover, the tones we use most frequently in speaking with one another predict what the authors called the relative consonance of different chromatic scale tone combinations, which is the ingredients of harmony and melody. And they suggest that the intervals we most like to hear in music, the melodies and harmonies that sound the sweetest to us, mirror the ones we used most, unconsciously, in speaking. In other words, our very idea of what music is seems to, at least to some degree, be built in, evolved. It comes to us via that same route that we acquired everything else about our bodies, our sweat glands, our 10 fingers and toes, our warm-bloodedness, our hemoglobin, our DNA, and our voices, or our instruments, give us a way to take something from the world of our minds, the endless combinations of the categories of colors and notes, and play in it, manifest it, project it out into the world. But then there's the question of whether that in itself is enough. And I think this is where we can start to talk about the difference between art that speaks and art that listens. This is from the wall of a canal shunted off the Danube River in Vienna, Austria. And it's an interesting place because graffiti is allowed, even encouraged here. Anyone can paint anything on its walls. And this takes something important away from graffiti because there's always something powerful about breaking someone's rule and leaving evidence that you did it, that whether you like it or not, I was here. I am. But this canal is like an experiment where that variable has been eliminated. And because there's no risk involved in making that statement, the pure tags lose a lot of their power and your eye sort of bounces off of them. But there's also a lot of art on the walls of this canal that's more than tags. Some of it on a pretty impressive scale. And what really struck me about these pieces was the sense of generosity they projected. Some of them took the form of careful additions to other art that's already been put there, like these little birds that are giving some extra life to this panda. Some pieces seem to have been left alone out of a kind of respect you can sense, or maybe they're just new. Here's one done by my friend Nicole. She calls it the hypno owl. And nobody gets paid for these images. They just do this. And they do it knowing that these paintings will be modified, defaced, encrusted with tags, painted over. They don't even pretend to hope for the kind of permanence we're often told artists are supposed to long for. And in that way, they have more of the spirit of a musical performance than an artifact. There's a feeling that they're here because they want to interact with you. They want to listen to you. They want you to puzzle over them, and they offer a number of different ways in. But my favorites all seem to say not just, here I am, but who are you? Why is our world like this? Could it be different? They invite you in. They don't just say, I am. They say, we are. These images have stayed with me as a sort of litmus test when I'm trying to figure out why I like a work of art or I don't. And I think the I am impulse comes ultimately from our fear of death and our desire to fight it or refute it by asserting the fact of our own life and being. But after the sugar rush of that, there's an emptiness because it's futile. We are art, on the other hand, springs from a deeper source, an embrace of life and of death too. It doesn't just speak, it also listens. Some of my favorite music, including the piece by Morton Feldman that we've been listening to in the background, has this quality about it. You feel almost as if it's listening to you. One way that college can really fail you, I think, especially if you're the sort of person who cares a lot about your grades, is that it can teach you to value knowledge over learning. You've been trained since you started going to school that I don't know is always the wrong answer. So the challenge is, how can you, after you leave here, turn learning from a never-ending series of cramming for tests, churning out papers, and vying for internships to something you actually want to do, where not knowing, where listening is a delicious instead of an annoying or terrifying feeling. And here's where I can finally talk about birds a little bit. A lot of people I've met who are really into birds can tell you not just about a certain time or place in their lives, but a specific individual bird that hooked them, that somehow struck them in a way that opened their eyes to a world that had been hidden from them, and that they suddenly realized they wanted. It made wading through a lot of fairly dull-seeming stuff, rote memorization of names, of winter and summer plumages, calls and songs and silhouettes, more like pursuing a lover than anything else I can really compare it to, which is hard work everybody here has probably suffered through at one time or another. I've seen sober scientists get a little mystical and shy when they talk about these first birds. For one friend who works for Texas Parks and Wildlife, it was an anhinga he shot as a boy, a primitive-looking water bird, sometimes called a snake bird or a water turkey. It's about as close in form to a dinosaur as you're likely to see. He waded up to it in the marsh, turned its long, strange body over in his hands, and something in him changed. For another friend who's now spent 30 years working in the Amazon, it was a little yellow warbler perched in a bush next to him in Indiana when he was a child. For some reason, these animals, these moments, come bearing something that makes you look again, that invites you into their world and lets you see it in a way that you haven't before, even though it's been right there all your life. And for me, it was these birds. This is a striated caracara. Here's a group of them on an island in the Falklands. And there's one lurking around some unsuspecting penguins. And beyond the otherworldliness of these birds and their islands, I think it was what I recognized in them that was so uncanny and that hooked me. Why, at the far end of the world, would I find a rare animal in whose lives I could sense this sort of everything but the kitchen sink approach to life that so oddly and comically mirrored our own? The medieval mystic Meister Eckhart said that the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. And it was only in meeting the eyes of these birds that I felt like I started to understand what that meant. I knew nothing at all about them, but I wanted to learn. And 20 years later, I still do. This moment of discovery, of joy in finding something beautiful and strange that you never knew existed, and yet feels somehow familiar, is the closest analogy I can think of to the part of the artistic process that I think hooks everybody sooner or later. Sometimes a little thought or an image or a musical phrase will just occur to you, and it can be as furtive and enticing as the flash of a little yellow bird in the leaves of a cottonwood. It grabs your attention, it draws you in, and if you concentrate, it might reveal a world beyond itself. Birds are also a useful reminder that the world we've birthed like Athena from our own heads, the fantasies we've projected onto the landscape, have opened a rift in the world itself. So much so that some geologists now say we've entered a new geological epoch in which the actions of human beings have so changed the surface of the earth that there are soils called technosols and anthrosols, and that even if we were to vanish today, the evidence of our having existed would be visible millions of years from now. It can be tempting to imagine sometimes that we don't really intersect with nature, that somehow we don't actually share the same space, or at least that there are somewhere still places that we can't reach or affect, where life continues as it did for the billions of years before we were everywhere. The Falklands can be like this, and these places have this eerie, flickering beauty that holds out the vision of what the world might have been like before we were everywhere. But nowhere is really safe from us anymore, and I think it's bad to let yourself buy into what I'd call the Animal Planet fantasy of the wilderness. When my grandfather was born, there were 1.2 billion people on Earth. There are now almost 8 billion people on Earth, headed for 10 by 2050, and this means that about 12% of all the human beings who have ever lived in the entire history of our species are alive right now. So, in the short term at least, it's not going to get any easier for other living things to get away from us. This, the red balloon there, is located at Midway Atoll, which is an island about as far away from humans as you can get. And there are nearly 2 million albatrosses nesting here. But they've been dying recently for a strange and unsettling reason. They're full of plastic that they ingested while feeding from the surface of the ocean. A few of the billions of pieces of garbage from the human world that are bobbing along the breadth of the Pacific Gyre and sinking into its depths. And this one wasn't alone. I can't think of a starker illustration of our dissonance with the world we came from, or the ways that the fate of much of life on Earth is now bound up with our fantasies, our desires, our appetites, our waste. And my hope, if that's the right thing to call it, is in the fact that thought, action, and art often take root most powerfully in moments of dissonance, in moments when we see ourselves in context but out of tune. But I wouldn't have started thinking about any of this if I hadn't met those caracaras, if they hadn't showed me that the world is richer and stranger than I'd ever imagined. My friend whose messenger was that little yellow warbler in Indiana now looks at birds in the Amazon and sees them in relation to their closest relatives, their landscape, their environment throughout thousands, even millions of years, and I have a feeling, though I've never asked him, that he sometimes steps even further back, thinks about them as a way that the stuff of the universe has for an instant been organized, that just for this moment, this little collection of matter has gathered itself into a being with a mind, with desires, with the urgency and complexity and finitude of life until it's broken and scattered back into the void. And this rush of moving between scales, from the quotidian to the infinite, in a breath, in a glance, is also, I think, what happens in the truest and most generous art. This unusual painting is called The Sphinx and the Milky Way by the 20th century American artist Charles Birchfield. And this is a painting about context above almost everything else to me. Our Sphinx is a Sphinx moth who's hovering down there in the bottom of the frame while the Milky Way looms above her. What I love is that in this image, Birchfield resolves the focus on objects that are as close as your hand and also light years away without diminishing either one, and makes them seem intensely related. Birchfield, who died in the late 50s, was a keen observer of nature, and thousands of pages of journal entries he left behind describe many hours spent in the woods and fields of his native Ohio and the plants and animals that flourished there. but his watercolors of natural scenes, which became more feverish and fantastic throughout his life, show a world full of portals, like the thin places of Celtic myth where the natural and supernatural worlds are nearly touching. I love this painting even more when scientists in South Africa announced a few years ago that on clear moonless nights, male dung beetles use the bright stripe of the Milky Way to help them navigate in a straight line as they roll their precious globes of dung into a burrow to feed their young. And they do this because they want to. They want to more than they want any other thing, probably as much as you've ever wanted anything in your life. The music, wrote the author David Mitchell, describing a distant harpsichord, provokes a sharp longing the music soothes. It doesn't solve or resolve anything, but it does tell you that you aren't as alone as you feel. Jean Paul Levay described the daily work of his filmmaking this way: wading around in water up to your ankles or navel, day and night, in all kinds of weather, even in areas where one is sure to find nothing, digging about everywhere for algae or octopus, or getting hypnotized by a sinister pond where everything seems to promise marvels, although nothing lives there. This is the ecstasy of any addict, or as a poet once put it, describing that compulsion, that itch in the deep center of the brain that invites us into the call and response that makes life feel worth living. What do I know that is shaped as this thing is shaped?
Let me let you go back to the conversation and your presentation for a minute to just kind of get to sort of some of the fundamental points that you shared with the audience.
Well, the lecture was adapted from one that I'd started a few years ago, previous to that was about the connections between art and nature, which I thought, oh, that's easy. But I was thinking about the connections between the scientific and the artistic approach to the world, and the ways that what science has showed us over the last couple of centuries has really fundamentally changed the way that we understand and appreciate the world, except that it kind of hasn't too, because most of some of the largest truths of scientific truths that we know, the universal of all life and the actual age of the earth, the fact that the continents move on plates over the soft mantle of the earth, that you spend your entire life closer to outer space than you do to, most likely the nearest major city. Mm-hmm. These things are so big and so strange that we kind of carry on mostly as we did before we knew any of this stuff. But when you spend time in the presence of these ideas, they're really profoundly inspiring, and the kinds of response that you give back to them is artistic.
What do you mean it's artistic? Explain that.
Well, art is sort of, I think I compared it to sort of like a ringing phone in the talk. There's a feeling that you get when you think about the fact that you're related, as past me was just saying, to an oak tree and a bee and an amoeba, in the same way that you are to your nearest family. It's just a difference of degree, but not of kind. That creates a very strong it makes you realize this bond that you share with everything that's around you. I mean, we're so preoccupied with what goes on right in here that we've sort of, I think of the internet and the very medium that we're talking through as something that kind of sprang like Athena out of the head of Zeus. It just was a pure product of our desire to create a world and live in it. But the thing is, we already have a world that we live in, and the interactions, the conversations between those two things are really fun to think about, and they open up all kinds of avenues for expression. That science is one response to that, to actually go out and measure things in the world and try to see if you can understand it by putting forward hypotheses and testing them.
Sure.
And in fact, I think, the very best scientists have to use an awful lot of imagination in their work, which I think doesn't get as much credit as it often deserves. At the same time, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to.
No, at the same time, art can really be informed by a knowledge of where you are, because where you are is so astounding, hard to even think about.
So what I wanted to ask you, the title of this event in our talk here is Communicating the Harmonies of Art and Science.
Yeah.
When you launched your big, your big adventure with your Watson Fellowship, and you went to the Falklands and you went all around the world, and this is where your science interest sort of exploded, as I understand it. You already had.
Yeah, that was in 1997. I was just a newly minted undergraduate and didn't really know anything about anything. And I had proposed this project to go to the ends of the earth, even though I'd never left the southeastern United States at that point, because I wanted to see what it was like for people who really lived in isolation, surrounded in an unignorable way by the natural world. But when I went to these places, and the Falklands was one of the first ones I went to, and it really changed the way I thought about everything, I suddenly got glimpses of this pre-human world. There in particular, there are these remote islands that are covered in seabirds and penguins and albatrosses, diving petrels, and these strange creatures called caracaras, striated caracaras, which had puzzled Darwin when he saw them. They're sort of like a bird of prey that looks something like a cross between a raven and a hawk.
Yeah.
They're actually related to falcons. But the Falklands are unique in that they're maybe the only part of the entire quote unquote new world that Europeans actually discovered. As so far as we know, there were no people there until Europeans turned up a couple of hundred years ago.
But here's what I want to ask you. When you're down there and you're discovering all of this and you're going on the same journey, or not the same journey, but a similar journey to Darwin, and you quote Darwin right at the opening, the first pages of your book, and I want to come to that in a minute, but you already had your aptitude and your interest in music, right?
To some, I mean, my family was musical, and so it had been a strong presence in my life up to that point.
Were you conscious then, though, of bringing science and art or artistic expression together, or is that something that developed from your trajectory?
That.
How?
Well, we talk sometimes about, that you're supposed to, if you want to be a writer, you're supposed to write what you know. But I think in some ways that can be bad advice, because it doesn't always mean write what you know already. But, maybe it would be a good idea to go learn something. As anybody who's ever been to, anytime you go to a place you've never been to before, your brain just lights up. Suddenly you notice everything, because your mind is trying to understand the situation and figure out what it can ignore. And then it just goes through muting everything, like switching off switches in a circuit breaker. And before long, you're looking at a very narrow range of things within that place. But when you're first there, you get all of it. And it's there's this sort of ecstasy that comes with that. That's a very artistic state. Your brain can suddenly make connections between things that it had never made before.
So you're doing this incredible year-long journey in 1997, and you were in the Falklands, and you were in Tierra del Fuego at the very southern tip of the continent, and you went to New Zealand, and you went to some Aboriginal island in Canada. I mean, this is a hell of a year.
It was, and it's hard to come back from.
I would imagine party is still there. I mean, that stays with you forever, right?
I was just talking to a scientist in the Falklands today, yeah.
And is that where your science inspiration came from, and how did that crystallize for you?
Well,
I mean, an incredible book, and I know you're working on another one.
In the early stages of, yes.
Right? This wasn't just a travelogue you were on.
No, I mean, I didn't know what that year meant for a long time, and I'm still learning things about it, because it was just so profoundly disorienting and confusing, and I have to say that it really was the moment that I locked eyes with a striated caracara on an island in the Falklands, because I had not expected to see these birds. I didn't know what they were. I'd never heard of them. They just walked up to me, which is what they do. They're birds of prey and they fly, but they also really like to walk around on the ground. And unlike falcons that people might be more familiar with in the northern world, like kestrels and peregrines and things, they have another muscle in their legs that allows them to walk with great ease. Darwin compared them to running around like pheasants. And they walk up and they look at you and they look right into your eyes and they look at you as if they have every bit as much of a right to be there as you.
I want to hover on this for a minute because it's an incredible experience. I think almost a spiritual experience. And I've shared that when I've been in the Galapagos, and the creatures there are fearless, and they do that, whether they're sea lions or. So how did that feel to you? Because literally they will walk, they do not fly away from you, right? They come up to you.
Yeah, they look at you without fear. And one of the things that I realized over the course of writing the book, and it's one of those things that's so obvious that you don't think about it, is that this is what humans' encounters with all animals were like the first time. So
Before
when
we
people
discovered that we were going to kill them and have them for dinner.
Well, right, they have no reason to fear you, and so they don't. I mean, unless they're afraid of a large moving object in some way. I mean, there is in the Falklands, there's an exception now in that like fur seals and sea lions, if they see you, run like the devil was after them, because there was a sealing industry there briefly. But these and the ones that survived were the ones that were more fearful, at least in theory. But
I want to come back to science and stay on that for a minute, but I do want to in this other thread, and again, invite our audience, if you've got questions for Jonathan, put them in the Q&A and I'll get to them quickly. And Phil, jump in with any of this if you want to, because this is, open season here. In your book, you quote, in your book, a most remarkable creature, the hidden life epic journey of the world's smartest bird of prey. I'll come back to that. There it is. But you quote Darwin early on, who preceded you, shall we say, in this area, visiting this terrain aboard the HMS Beagle, and he wrote, and you quote, "In these solitudes, death instead of life is the predominant spirit."
Darwin was talking about the forests of Tierra del Fuego at that point, and not the Falklands. But go ahead.
Right. No, what I wanted to ask you is, as you were experiencing life in all of its dimensions in this extraordinary journey of yours, was death, and because that's part of life, was that a defining component for you?
In what sense?
Well, you realize this kind of incredible cycle of life. And here's Darwin commenting on all of this, and you're seeing the full life cycle. I'm wondering what you focused on.
Gosh, I had no idea that the world could be like that. I'd as I said, grown up in the southeastern United States, and I loved walking around in the woods and the rivers and all that kind of thing. But I had not seen a place where you could so clearly imagine a world without people, because it was a place that by and large had not experienced us to the same degree that other places had. And so there was sort of this it was like a receiving a transmission from the past, because it's very much alive and very much still part of our world. And it really made in college I'd studied English literature, and which I still love, but it made me think about, there's a lot of the world that's not encompassed by that tradition. And it gave me a great many things to think about. I'd always, I'd noticed birds, but I never really thought about them in particular. I never thought about what they were or where they came from. And Darwin's question about striated caracaras, which he basically let lie, was, what are these birds doing in these remote islands and nowhere else? Because there's about as many of them today as there are giant pandas. But they don't seem like that kind of animal. They seem like something that would be common. They just are so curious, and there's something so identifiable in their gaze that you feel a connection with them, despite the fact that we haven't had a common ancestor in at least 150 million years.
So you're doing this trip in '97. When did you publish the book?
Oh, this year.
So it's brand new, and you were working on it for how long?
Oh gosh, I mean, about 7 years since the contract was signed. But when you think of it, connecting all the way back to those early experiences,
when did your
it's about 25 years.
When did you begin your big music career?
That started while I was in graduate school, essentially. I turned a 2-year master's degree into a 6-year master's degree at the University of Texas at Austin.
So Jonathan, are you a musician who happens to be a scientist, or a scientist who happens to be a musician?
It depends on who's asking.
No, I'm asking.
I don't know whether if you have to be one thing or another.
Oh, I love that answer.
I don't understand why you can't be both. It depends on the context. I've been very lucky in having an incredible degree of freedom in what I want to think about and do.
How does I meant that question almost in jest, because I think what gives you your remarkable and very unique perspective is the art that you bring to your science and the science that you bring to your art. How do they influence one another?
Well, I don't think that art and science are really, they're very close cousins. They both involve asking questions and trying to find answers to those questions. I mean, I think anyone who's ever worked on a big project is realizes they've set themselves a problem and they're going to have to find some way to resolve it. In a work of art, whether it's film or music or a book, you have to have a narrative arc. You have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have to think about who your audience is, and you have to take them on this journey with you so that you can convey what it is that you're trying to convey. That's just as true in science, although people are often working on small pieces of a much larger puzzle, so we'll get these sort of grand syntheses as much. If you ever go back and look at like the Transactions of the Royal Society, which was this, it's still published today, but it's the publication in which, for instance, Darwin and Wallace's theory about evolution by natural selection was first published. Before it became more segregated into different disciplines, an issue of it would have an article about astronomy, something about mathematics. I looked up an account of a penguin colony in the Falkland Islands once and found on the facing page a description of a promising young musician in Europe who was about 8 or 9 years old and could just play the harpsichord in this extraordinary way. And the person who was making this description said that it asked him to play something in the style of someone else, and that this young person looked at it with an expression of utmost archness and then began to do just this. And of course, it was Mozart. But you get the feeling that there was a time when all these pursuits were more unified and more connected to one another. And as the sort of world of knowledge grew, that became more and more unwieldy. But I think that there's every person has to learn everything for themselves, and not everything known is written, and not everything written is known. Things get forgotten, perspectives get forgotten, knowledge gets forgotten all the time, and we don't automatically stand on. You don't just sort of absorb by osmosis everything that everyone has learned. We're always in danger of losing what we've gained.
I want to put the first question to you from the audience, and thank you for those who are putting questions into the Q&A. I think you can also upvote those questions there, and that helps us see what people are interested in. So here's the one from Daniel, who says, to start out, thank you so much for your amazing music and this talk. Some of your songs, Daniel writes, touch on religion, and it seems to be a theme on the songs released for Indiegogo backers from the new Shearwater album. But is it possible for you to elaborate on your views on faith?
Gosh. Well, actually, I was a religion minor in college because I became so interested in the correspondences between that and the literature part. It was like, if you're going to study Western literature, it helps to have some working knowledge of the Bible, whatever you think of it, because this was an important text for a lot of people who were writing in that tradition. And so it unlocks certain sort of symbolic things that might otherwise be hidden from you. I do think that there's no such thing as a person who doesn't behave religiously. Everybody interacts with the cosmos in a symbolic way, one way or another. I mean, it's everything from ideas about luck to just the little rituals you go through during the day to try to orient yourself within the universe. All of this is religious behavior. And so if you want to understand people, you have to understand what religion is and what its wellspring seems to be, and how it seems to be a deeply embedded feature of the human mind. Now, one thing I really love in talking to scientists who work on birds, but it's also true with other species, is there's often a moment, if you ask them, like, what was it that turned you on to this? And they'll say, oh, I saw this bird, or I saw this animal, I saw this plant. And something just unlocked for me. There was this kind of, scientists tend to get a little sort of mystical and quiet about this sometimes. And I think one of the most amazing things about the human mind, and also maybe its worst feature, as we were saying, is our ability to create these very elaborate imaginary worlds, memory palaces almost, and with which you interact symbolically. And scientists also participate in that because they have human brains, and artists also participate in that in a very profound way, ideally, because you're trying to step backwards from your conscious mind into a deeper and darker world of correspondences that you can draw.
Phil, let me draw you in here for a question for Jonathan. For those who don't know or who have joined us, Phil leads the writing in the disciplines at George Washington University. And this is our attempt to celebrate great writing and show the importance of narrative and teach it and make sure that anybody who comes out of GW is a darn good writer. But it's also about celebrating narrative and storytelling and all the rest. So Phil, why don't you have a question for Jonathan?
Sure. Actually, this is kind of the WID question, which I was thinking about your comment about fields being more unified in the past. And one of the things that comes out of the university model that gets adopted all across Europe and the United States is this specialization. And one of the components of WID is that professors in WID courses are having students engage in writing that's characteristic of the discipline, and thinking in modes of the discipline and evidence, how do we treat evidence in this discipline, and why do we in this discipline write in this or that way? And what you're doing is sort of pushing against a lot of that, I think, in really productive ways. And I want to see if I can can I read a footnote from your book?
Sure.
But I want to use this to ask this question, because I think the kind of specialization required to do academic science is such that it mitigates against you also being a professional musician. And I would say vice versa, the kind of musical knowledge and practice and time and commitment and all of that mitigates it against you being a full-time academic scientist, right? But you've created this amazing sort of space where you get to do both. And I think the pragmatic question is, what was it like for you? All the scientific literature on the caracara and more.
Well, luckily, yes, because there's not very much of it. I have my friend Julia Clark, a paleontologist who appears in the book in a couple of places, studies one of the many things she studies is the evolution of birds' vocal organ. Unlike other vertebrates, birds have a vocal organ that they basically evolutionarily came up with. It's different from the larynx, which precedes it in evolutionary time. because of various demands on their bodies, they had to sort of create another one called a syrinx. And when Julia started studying this structure in the past, she said, I went looking for information on this, and what I found was a fascinating paucity of knowledge. And it's really, there's something that really glows when you can look at a body of knowledge and say, wow, there's not very much here. There's a place for me to do something. And that feeling of opportunity is strange because it comes in these empty spaces, or things that are disguised as unimportant. I mean, the caracaras that I spend so much time talking about how wonderful they are a group of birds that have mostly kind of been dismissed by people who specialized in birds of prey. The guy who's kind of a hero of my book, William Henry Hudson, who was a 19th and early 20th century naturalist and writer, grew up in Argentina and admired and liked the caracara species he knew in his youth. And he said that a bird so cosmopolitan in its habits would have a whole volume to itself in England, but being only a poor foreigner, it has had no more than a few unfriendly paragraphs bestowed upon it. And finding those opportunities, which is something that Julia is especially good at, and it's part of why I was drawn to her as a subject in the book and character in the book, is a skill that I think the best writer, or the best artists and scientists are able to develop and pursue and do not just once, but many times. I mean, this was, in some ways, this was Darwin's great skill. Darwin wasn't a trained scientist. He was a rich kid whose dad let him go on this weird trip with a captain on this ship on a kind of boring surveying mission, who was worried about his own mental health because the previous captain of the boat on the same mission had committed suicide. So, Darwin didn't come with any particular qualifications besides being very, very curious about things and being good at making connections between what he saw and larger patterns of the world that he didn't understand. And when you think about what he was able to come up with, given what knowledge was available to him at the time, it's really quite something. Like, he didn't know that the continents could move. That discovery would wait for many years. And yet understanding the patterns of the distribution of life, living things on Earth, was, what am I trying to say here? It's unintelligible without knowing that the continents move.
Yeah, Jonathan, let me put an audience question to you. And this brings in the other side of you. Richard asks, which Shearwater song or songs do you think most closely approximate the world you depict in A Most Remarkable Creature?
Oh man, it's hard for me. People, every once in a while, someone asks me, "Why do you put so many birds in your songs?" I'm like, I don't. There's very few. There's.
You don't have to take the question literally.
Well, the thing about writing songs is that a song is there's the words of the song, and then there's the music that accompanies them. And the songs that I like best, neither part of it can really stand on its own. Kind of like a lichen where you've got a fungus and an alga that are working together, and neither one can survive very well on its own, but they work really well together. So a song to me is not just the words and the tune; it's the entire sonic environment that you create around those things. And there was an author who said that a novel is something that you're trying to say something that takes that long to say it. If you could distill it into an aphorism or something, there would have been no point in writing the novel. And so at their best, and I definitely don't always hit this, but every once in a while it does seem to happen, where the song seems to express something that's beyond the ability to explain it. And
can you give us an example? If people want to go search and listen, where would you inspire them to go?
I mean, if you're talking about my own work, yes. When I listen to my own work, I almost always hear only the flaws in it, the things that I know weren't right. Like everyone, I tend to say that the thing I did most recently was the one that I like the best, because that's the closest to you're the closest you are to the version of you that made it at that time. So the new Shearwater record, I think, is the best one. It's not out yet, so I can't send you to it, but it should be coming out, I think, in February. And it actually includes some pieces of the book in certain ways. There's a moment in the book where I describe a toucan calling, and it was calling on the side of a river where the other side of the river had this massive cut bank, this sort of sheer wall of clay, and the toucan was calling, and the way that this cut bank and the river were interacting, because it was very still at that place, were such that it was getting back a single perfect echo of its call. And the toucan was just yelling his head off. And I couldn't tell if he was just enjoying the way that sounded because it was really cool and it made him bigger and louder and it was just fun, or if he maybe had thought that he'd encountered a really game opponent who was just matching him blow for blow, and he's just like singing louder and louder and louder and louder while this other guy just kept coming back at him. I made a recording of that, and that is in one of the songs. There's a toucan solo in one of the songs, and which sounds like it'd be really silly, but in context, it's kind of mysterious. I also put some howler monkeys in there because they're just the weirdest sound in the world.
Not known for their harmony, but there's a certain harmony there.
It's very musical. Every sound in that forest in Guyana was musical, and so profoundly musical that it made human music seem pretty dopey in comparison.
Another question for you. We are really fortunate at George Washington University to have a National Geographic professor of science communication. Her name is Lisa Palmer, and Lisa she works with us in Planet Forward too, and she teaches classes. Got a question for you. This is a really great one. As a science journalist, she writes, I love science journalism and wish there were more of it. But I agree that science and journalism and art, writing, music, / have much in common. I teach that. You don't have to be one or the other. She goes on, if the only place our audiences typically find science is in the science lab of news media, if it's not connected to other areas of their life and issues, it's easy to ignore. So her question, how can we as a creative community get more science into our stories, ideas, and creative pursuits?
Well, for me, the fun is in wandering out into a place where you don't understand something. A lot of scientists get kind of frustrated about the fact that just to have a conversation with someone who's not conversant in their field, they have to go so far back just to bring you up to speed. So there are an awful lot of really interesting stories out there that are just lurking in the minds of people who are exhausted with trying to explain them and just want to get on with their work, for which I don't blame them at all. But in the book, I took just this question of Darwin's and then mine, what are these birds and what are they doing here? And as I just kept pulling on that thread, more and more stuff started to come out until suddenly I was having to reckon with a story that was 65 million years long and encompassed the moving of the continents and the ways that landscape and wildlife had changed and why there were opossums in North Carolina and why there aren't crows in South America. And how it is that some birds can have minds so similar to ours that you're actually able to hold conversations in your language with them, despite the fact that they evolved their forebrain out of a different structure in their brains. And so, but this all just stemmed from this one question. And so I think there's an element of it where it's just find something that confuses you, find something that you don't understand, and keep pulling on it and see what comes out. I mean, that's what journalists always have to do.
So Amy has, from our audience, Amy has the perfect follow-up question to this. She starts by saying, thanks for doing this, Jonathan. So I'll echo that. She's a fan of the book. She asks, have you considered writing a book about the caracara that's targeted towards children? Imagine your passion for the bird would translate well for children too, she says.
That's an interesting thought. To tell you honestly, I feel a little done with caracaras, but I mean that's something I'd consider though. Sure, I mean there are some wonderful stories you could tell about them that would be very well suited to children. I know there's a caracara coloring book that was put out by a place called Hawk Mountain in the United States.
Well, I think you're onto something here. And one way to extend science into storytelling and narrative is to have science and science as narrative be brought to our kids earlier on, and interest them, engage them. There is actually so much suspense and surprise and great characters and resolution and mystery and in science, that it's kind of a natural for that, what we call the story arc, right?
Well, Darwin, and part of the reason that I really like him as a character in the book, where he's not throughout the book, and he's a very well-mined subject. I mean, there's many books have been written about Charles Darwin, but what I liked about him was that when he turned up in these places, he was 22 years old, same age I was when I turned up in the Falklands, and he did not know what he was doing. When you read The Voyage of the Beagle, it has that wonder and surprise and even silliness in places. And Darwin could ride horses and could shoot things because that was what he liked to do as an upper class twit of the year in England. That this was his idea of fun, and little did he know this would actually really come in handy when he was trying to ride around with gauchos in the Falklands on the open ground and try to shoot various animals that he could collect and bring back on board the Beagle. And but he seized that opportunity with both hands, and that kind of even though that kind of opportunity isn't available to everyone, and it's important to remember that, he took something that was available that no one else could exactly see, and made it his own over time. But it gets very easy to think of him as the photographs you see of him, where he's this white-bearded ancient with a 1,000-yard stare, and that's not the Darwin that I was engaging with in the book.
Yeah, well, speaking of narrative, Michael has a question about that. What do you see, Michael asks, as the overarching narrative of A Most Remarkable Creature?
In terms of its shape? In terms of what's the point of this book?
Well, what's the narrative? What's the story arc?
Well, another writer gave me a piece of advice once, which said that if you're writing a story like this, you need to start from begin with simplicity, move towards complexity, and then return to simplicity by the end, which is really good advice. Because I tried to presume that the audience maybe had a general interest in nature but didn't know anything about birds or care. And which is where I started from. So I tried to bring you on a sort of, I tried to condense the sort of 25 years of thinking and wondering and floundering around that I'd done into a story that would make some sense, so that I could bring you into the larger understanding of why the world is the way it is, in the way that I understood it, but instead of 25 years, it would take a few days to read the thing. And then it was a matter of trying to figure out what scenes you could put together to illustrate that point, to start with the mystery of these funny birds on these islands that were stealing hats and compasses and other objects from the crew of the Beagle, and keep kind of slowly zooming out from that moment and see, okay, how does this fit into the larger story of what was going on in South America, about the way animals moved around in there, about why you would have a mind like this in the first place, and to just keep adding on episode after episode that would make that larger. And then my favorite part of the book actually is the trip in Guyana, which is between chapters 11 and 15, which is sort of like the book, after having gone through a lot of really pretty elaborate discussions about natural history and the history of the continents and their animals and everything, suddenly goes on this sort of long, weird camping trip for about 100 pages. And what I wanted to do was to have set you up at that point, such that you could experience that as I was experiencing it, but also with some of this backstory so that you could understand it, and that it would make more sense to you, and the things that were extraordinary about that trip are become more apparent.
There are a number of questions here, and I've got two before we run out of time here, but here's a really good one that comes from someone in our audience. I'm interested in inspiring people who act on issues that are based in often misunderstood science, like climate change and extinction.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think about using art to bridge these gaps that are out there? Is there a space for art based in natural science when many people haven't had the chance or interest to learn about it? That's the question.
Yes, there is space. I think there's a greater and greater appreciation of this, actually. I mean, this is the struggle that museums go through. Is like, on the one hand, they've got a scientific mission. On the other hand, they have an outreach mission. And sometimes those things are kind of misaligned.
Right.
But I think you can, people don't get enough credit for how much they're able to absorb and digest if it's presented in the right way. I mean, I think we've all had the experience of listening to someone somehow make a really intrinsically fascinating subject just deadly boring. You know, I fell asleep in lectures in college about things that were objectively absolutely fascinating. So the job of artists, I think, is to try to make sure that you make it that last crucial distance from the page or from the screen or whatever into the mind of the people that you're trying to communicate with. I mean, go ahead.
No, here's another question. I just want to get to a couple of other questions here that are great. Miriam has a really interesting question. This might be a publishing question, she writes, but here goes. I feel like there's been a small but hopefully sustained boom in excellent books about birds that bring together science and literary writing. She's thinking of Helen MacDonald, she says, and Jonathan Slott and others.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on what might be behind this? She says, I could be totally off base, but I've definitely wondered about it.
Birds sell, and publishers know it.
Really?
It's always, you know, when you wade into the realm of trying to publish a commercial book as opposed to an academic book, this is something that you have to convince a publisher not only that your subject is worthy, but also that they can actually sell it. And luckily, I do think there's been an increased interest in birds, just certainly in my lifetime.
How's your book?
It's doing fine. It's not like some crazy bestseller.
Well, we can change that here. As I said, when we started, everybody here buys 100 books, and they get 100 people to buy 100 more books. You see, we can create a whole sensation for you.
There you go. Well, I'll be watching the sales figures. I mean, the most 8% of books sell less than 5,000 copies. This one's done much better than that, so I feel really good about it, especially because it's a first-time author who has no particular qualifications besides being a musician on an obscure subject. And it's not my favorite review of the book said that that comparing it to calling it a bird book was like calling Moby Dick a whaling manual. And Moby Dick is one of the most extraordinary things ever written. It's just
you're being modest, and that's very nice. But you're an incredible writer. I mean, it's not just what you say, but how you say. You know, I talk to students a lot, and I know Phil does this too. And I have some bumper stickers about story and the hero's journey and a few other things. But one of my bumper stickers, and Kim and Victoria and Lisa and all my friends know this because I say it 5 million times a day, is a great story is about compelling characters overcoming obstacles to achieve a worthy outcome, right? You got to create a compelling character. What are they up against and what are they trying to do? You create compelling characters in your book, and you're one, actually.
Well, I tried to keep myself out of the book as much as I could.
But you come through. It's the way you come through as a character by how you express yourself and where you go.
Well, authorial presence is a funny thing. I mean, I feel like now there seems to be a lot more of it than there maybe was 30 or 40 years ago. And it's very powerful as a tool. A writer whose work I really admire, Peter Matheson, was always interesting to me because he was always messing with this. Every one of his books, he was present in it to a different degree. Some of them he's not there at all as an I character. Sometimes he's there a lot. But the thing is that what I wanted to avoid was having it become a story about me.
Right.
Because I'm not the interesting thing to me in the context of this story. This isn't a memoir. All the same, there were moments where, you know, as a reader, you have to be looking through somebody's eyes somehow. And if the only person you can get to stitch a series of events together is you, then you're going to have to appear in that way.
You make your most remarkable creature a compelling character too.
Well, they don't need any help. They're just amazing. If I put one in front of you, you'd be in love with it within 5 minutes. They're just.
But you said before, somebody can take a very interesting topic and make it boring, right?
Yeah,
sure. Not do that. You did not do that. You made it fascinating. I have one question that I'd like to ask you, and then we're going to wrap with another question quickly or two from the audience. I interview authors all the time, and I have a favorite question I ask authors, which is in doing this book, this labor of love. Writing a book is an immense undertaking. It takes years. It takes incredible energy, devotion. What did you learn that you didn't expect, that was a surprise to you about yourself or about the world around you? What came out of this process? It's like, whoa.
Well, an understanding about the larger patterns of life on Earth since the Cretaceous extinctions, which sounds like I'm talking about some natural history textbook. But it's one thing to just say that, and another to really think, oh my God, there were like things like horses with hands that lived in North America. There were giant armadillos. There were giant ground sloths and marsupial saber-tooths. And I mean, we're just talking about a small slice of vertebrate animals, but the world is just way more weird and extraordinary than I had ever imagined. And that was before Past Me was cut off there. I was talking about that with the French filmmaker Jean-Paul Levay, where he said, reality is a creator of a surreal life. His feeling was that the human imagination was not anywhere near as sophisticated as the world that actually exists around us, and that apprehending it is kind of like participating in or recognizing an imaginative act on an unbelievable scale that exists independent of us. And I mean, if that doesn't provoke an almost religious state in you, I don't know what to tell you.
Two quick final questions from the audience. One from David, says, I love your book, and I love the video of the two young striated caracaras opening it.
Yes.
How did that scene, he asks, come to be? And you need to describe it for those who haven't seen it.
Okay, yes, there's a video. This was just sent to me a couple of days ago by a friend in the Falklands. She'd put my book on the ground near a group of young striated caracaras near her farm, and they just kind of walk around it and look at it and peer over it. And one of them kind of checks it out and seems to have had enough and wanders off. And then the second one comes into the frame and looks at it and gives it this funny sidelong look, and then kind of grabs at it with her foot, and then actually pulls it open and then just stares at it, looks sort of astonished. And it was just, I mean, the degree to which that delighted me just like can't be overstated. It was just amazing. It's like, well, my work here is done.
Well, congrats. We have to push that out on YouTube and see if we can get a million.
Yeah,
another good way.
Put it on my Twitter feed. It's yeah, I put it up just a couple of days ago.
Amy's got the zinger here. You ready? I always save the zinger for last. Will Shearwater tour with a new album?
I hope so. One thing that I've learned about performing live music is that it's not a money-making venture. So it's going to require some investment in order to make that happen, and it's probably not going to be on the scale that maybe I once did, or at least the distance. Because honestly, I feel like I've learned all that the small clubs and medium-sized clubs of the U.S. and Europe have to tell me. But at the same time, I really miss performing live, and we'll figure out a way to do it somehow within the next year.
So we have while we're in the music vein, we have a follow-up to that from your devoted audience here. When touring with your bands, do you have much opportunity to indulge in your scientific interests? And if so, is there any place you visited when touring that unexpectedly blew you away in that science regard?
Very rarely. I mean, the kinds of tours that I've always done have been like a show almost every single day. So you're really more like it's like being a truck driver, except for what you do at night. But I have had a few moments where I remember I had friends who invited me sort of backstage at the Smithsonian once, and we were playing a show in DC, and that was just a joy. And that actually ended up in the book, in the talking about an extinct caracara called the Guadalupe caracara, which they had the type specimen of, actually, and we'd take a look at that. But in general, touring is not really traveling exactly. You kind of feel like it's more like Groundhog Day. You keep turning up in these places that were very much like the place you just left, and then doing the same thing. So there are moments. I mean, there have been a few surprises.
Okay.
And once, actually, also again at the Smithsonian, oddly enough, I had a couple hours when I was free, and I went in and called up to a scientist named Stores Olson, who had described a fossil caracara from Jamaica that was flightless, or it was probably flightless. And I just said, hey, I'd like to talk to you about caracaras for a second. And he, to my great surprise, actually said, sure, and came down and took me back up to his office and showed me the bones, and we had an awesome conversation. It felt like I would somehow said the right password and opened a secret door. That was really a treat.
That's great. All right, I lied. We can't not end with this question. This is from Daniel. What is your most surprising advice for aspiring writers?
Well, just sort of what I said earlier. You don't have to write what you know already. Go learn something, and be surprised by something, and be confused by something, and be prepared to struggle with it. But the moments that certainly that I've thought, I don't know if I can do this, are have yielded the things that I feel the best about.
That's great advice. How about, I'm going to follow up with a variation on that question with a follow-up. How about your most surprising advice for aspiring scientists?
It's the same.
Don't be intimidated by what you don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I'm not a professional scientist, so I'm not the right person to ask for advice about that. But I do notice that the scientists who I've met, who really seem to enjoy their careers the most, are the ones who find a place where other people aren't looking, and are able to have some degree of freedom within that.
And what about your most surprising advice for musicians?
You know, a long time ago, the singer Jeff Mangum from Neutral Milk Hotel gave me some advice, which was, he said, when you're making a record, writing a song, whatever, it doesn't have to be the most infinitely amazing thing ever. If it is meaningful to you, it will be meaningful to others like you. And that doesn't guarantee that there will be many of those people, if you can find a way to make something that you feel like is that you feel good about, that you feel expresses something that you care about, there will be other people who sense that.
Right, that's Jonathan. I want to thank you. I'm going to give it back to Phil for a final closing thought here in just a second. But one of the reasons it's been such a delight to speak to you and so inspiring to hear what you've got to say, never mind what you've read and your artistic expression, is, this is what we see, so much power of the Planet Forward Project with students and others who can bring together deep thought and passionate commitment and talent and an ability to cross these lines, these sort of creative and intellectual lines. And I love to say that there's nothing more powerful than combining intellect and imagination. And I just want to celebrate you for what you've done and the book you've written and the music you make. You did say you're working on a new book that is going to be...
Right now, my working title is The Once and Future Life of Antarctica, which is, and in some ways, it'll be kind of a sequel, because Antarctica kind of looms in the background of this whole book, because I think it has, There are scientists who know about it that are not known to most people, that are astonishing about its past as a vibrant place, absolutely full of life. It's present as the same thing in ways that are quite surprising. It is not a big dead place. And then its future, which I think may once again lead to it being lush and green. One thing I did want to talk about that's important is that it's difficult to write about the natural world right now. As one of the questions touched on this. When we're confronted with environmental crises right and left, it seems like a horror show. And it's hard to write about it without being doomy or just really depressing. And for me, the way out of that, without, because you don't want to say everything's fine and have this kind of Animal Planet fantasy where there's wildernesses full of animals, don't worry, it's all great. It is to try to place the reader and yourself in context. Our experience of planet Earth as a species is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what life on Earth has been. And illuminating that, I mean, as a reader, it's fun to go places you've never been before and see things you never knew existed. As a human being, it's very comforting to be reminded that we're a part of this cycle of incredible cataclysmic destruction and improbable and astonishing reconstructions. That is the real story of life on Earth. And there is a great deal to be learned about it for scientists and artists alike.
You're here. We could have a whole separate conversation about dooms and how we put all of this in context, but it's why your book is such a contribution, and we need more of them and more of them engaged. Thank you again. We really appreciate it. And Phil, over to you for a final question or thought or anything you'd like to share. What a great conversation. What a great guest you've been.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Frank. And thanks to the audience for all the fantastic questions. I'm not seeing the questions, so I don't know. I'm sure we didn't get to all of them. But you guys were amazing and really, really shaped the conversation. I did want to take the liberty, if I could, to read that footnote, because I'm so happy to hear that your next book is about Antarctica.
I was hoping you were going to get to that.
So what I wanted to read, and I hope this is the opening anecdote of the second book. This is page 283, note 18. The 19th century American sailor, author, and crackpot John Cleves Sims Jr. believed that the remarkable wildlife of the polar regions, including penguins and whales, was evidence of a separate world inside the Earth to which they passed back and forth through giant portals. I declare the Earth is hollow, he wrote in 1817, and habitable within, containing a number of solid concentric spheres, one within the other, and that it is open at the poles 12 or 16 degrees. I pledge my life in support of this truth and am ready to explore the hollow if the world will support and aid me in the undertaking. I think that's your epigram for the second book.
Well, it just goes to show how wrong you can be. It's great. And you know, this is the human mind falling in love with an idea, which is what we all do. I mean, there's things that that we guarantee you we are particularly wrong about right now. And one of the things one of the lessons scientists really have to offer us, I think, in general, is that the delight in being wrong is an essential part of science, and it makes for the happiest scientists. That's a skill that's, I mean, it's very difficult to teach to students, especially because they've been told that they have to give the right answer all the time. The right answer may not be even available to us. We may not have the imagination to see it. We may not have the framework of knowledge that's required. So I think a measure of humility. Mr. Sims is a very special character, but he's not exceptionally stupid. He's conflating. He just couldn't believe that this wasn't so, because he fell in love with the idea.
Oh, we'll end it there. Thanks so much, Jonathan and Frank, and thanks to all of our audience. Everybody have a good night.